Well, I just want clarification. God bless the military, and I had 38 years in the military. We're really good at acronyms, but academia is the same way. So our University of Texas Health Science Center was rebranded. Talking about branding, Barry. We're UT Health San Antonio now, and our colleague, our wingman, our battle buddy right up the road is UTSA. So, and I hope there's somebody here from UTSA today. Is there? We certainly invited them, because there was the biomedical engineering department up there, which is really growing, and over the years, I'm confident we'll be an increasing partner here in the ecosystem that we have in this military health space. So we're now going to transition to a panel, and we've got Dr. Jose Salinas to lead to moderate the panel. But let me introduce Jose. He's the chief of the Clinical Decision Support and Automation Research Branch over at the ISR, and he is focusing on development of new clinical decision support technologies and solutions to improve outcomes for military combat casualties across all echelons of care. And this includes novel information technology, engineering products, and new approaches to communicate and automate different diagnoses and treatments. And he's coordinating multiple projects. He's one of our key partners here in San Antonio, and really working across academia, the military space, but also with our industry partners, and also with our city of San Antonio. So, Jose, over to you, and we're very fortunate. I guess you have, Jose, where is Jose? Right here. Did I understand you had some patents too, so he's moving forward economically too, as well as academically.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Jose. And I'll let you introduce our panelists if you would. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to moderate this panel. We're going to keep this relatively informal. If you don't like what I say, my name is actually Anthony Pusateri. So, no, seriously, Dr. Anthony Pusateri, who is my boss, he's the director of research. He's sitting over there in the audience. So if you any questions that I cannot answer, I'm going to punt over to him and he can take them over. But I want to thank the panelists. We're going to have basically a dialogue from the other side. So we heard from the military side and some of the requirements that, and some of the agreements that they normally work with academia to try to get some of these technologies out the door. Well, these are some of the guys that have actually been working on the academic side, and they're going to talk to us about some of their experiences. And we're going to open it up to the public. I do have some questions that I can get it started with. But what I'm going to do for now is I'm going to have each one introduce yourselves, talk about how you got involved with the military, what your product is, and then we'll go ahead and start the questions. So if you're going to go ahead and start, Bruce, over here on your end.
Hi, I'm Bruce Adams. I'm the chair of emergency medicine here at UT Health San Antonio, also chair of the emergency department, University Hospital. Prior to that, I did a career, retired colonel. I did 27 years in the U.S. Army. My Army career spanned from operational combat, special operations, to research and academics and teaching. We actually, along with Rob and many others, we actually started the academic emergency department here 5 years ago last month. And a big part of that has been a partnership in developing our research and our academic portfolio with the military.
Good morning. My name is Rob DeLorenzo, and I'm an emergency physician, and I had about a 32-year career that included reserves, National Guard, and then 20 plus years in the Army. I deployed several times to the combat zone, and now I work for Dr. Adams, and I'm the vice chair in the department, and it's a pleasure to be here.
I'm Steve Venticinque. I'm an anesthesiologist and critical care physician. I'm the vice chair of the Department of Anesthesiology, and my technology is in the realm of airway management. I practice surgical critical care and cardiac and transplant anesthesiology.
My name is Ramon Cestero. I'm a trauma surgeon. I did 10 years active duty in the Navy. I deployed 7 times in those 10 years. Because of that, I had significant challenges in some of the austere environments I ended up in, and I designed a surgical retractor. Now I run the Surgical Critical Care Fellowship Program and the Trauma Surgery Program at UT Health San Antonio, and I'm the director of the ICU.
I am Leon Bunegin of the Department of Anesthesiology. I'm an associate professor, and my laboratory has been involved in organ and tissue preservation for the last 30 years, and we've extended that technology to cover traumatically amputated limbs.
All right, so with that, let's go ahead and start a discussion. And like I said, these guys basically have experiences working on the other side, working with the military. So my first question to the group, and of course it's also open to the public, and that is, we already heard a couple of you guys were active duty, you either retired or you served some time in the military. But for the guys that did not serve, how did you get involved with the military, and what were your experiences in getting involved with some of our products?
Well, I believe I'm the only one on this panel that hasn't had the pleasure of serving our nation in the military. Not that I hadn't tried. When I was in Advanced Corps ROTC, I took my Advanced Corps physical and I failed. So I ended up with a 4F at a time when I had a draft number of 15. So I dedicated the rest of my life to science and education and teaching. Mainly, my association with the DoD was to extend a technology that we had developed in my laboratory to preserve organs. We have successfully been able to maintain a cardiac muscle for 24 hours and longer in a suspended state of animation without any perceptible deterioration after transplantation in an animal model. Subsequently, we ended up with an FDA approval for this preservation transport technology, and the DoD had recently released request for applications for proposals for a similar technology for limb preservation, and we've begun developing that technology for maintaining limbs that have been avulsed during combat.
Well, I think you kind of answered my next question, which is why would the military care about your particular product?
Well, there is an estimated cost of about $6 billion a year to maintain an individual, or to maintain individuals who have lost extremities as a result of combat activities. It would be very nice if we could pick up the pieces, somehow stabilize them, and transport them with the troop, such that when the troop is finally able to receive his avulsed limb, that limb would be in very good condition. As it stands now, there is nothing available that can keep that limb alive beyond about 4 to 6 hours.
Yeah, so one of the things that the military is very interested in is obviously the whole area of regenerative medicine, and this is kind of part of that. One of the biggest problems and one of the biggest gaps that we have in the military is, when a soldier steps on a landmine or an explosion, guess what happens? Part of your limbs get blown off. So the question is, well, you have two choices. You either leave the limb off, or you can regrow a new limb, or you can reattach the old limb, right? Obviously, the easiest solution is to have the limb, basically keep the limb off, but that really creates problems in the future. So this technology can potentially address one of those gaps, which is how to keep the limb that was blown off or injured preserved so that we can actually put it back on the soldiers. So I guess another question for you guys is, you guys have worked with the military, you work in the civilian arena. So, how do you see military technologies being applied in the civilian world and vice versa? How do we take some of the lessons learned from the civilian arena and move it into the military? And how do we make that happen more seamlessly?
Well,
okay, and Rob, you kind of sniffed there, so I'll let you take that first.
All right. So, in many cases, the audience, I believe, is probably mostly civilians looking to, essentially get their technology into the military. And from that standpoint, I think the key answer, at least from where I sit, is having an understanding of what the military truly wants. It's understanding what's their gap, and trying to align your product, your device, your drug with that military's needs. And Jose gave a great example, with amputations. It's clearly a significant military issue. It's rather unique to the military, although not exclusively, and understanding that environment is key to getting a civilian technology into the military. But the flip side is are there military technologies that are ripe for commercialization? And sure, there are probably a number. Probably one that I think is worth thinking about, because it's relatively recent and getting out there, is tourniquets. This was a technology that, well, was invented in the military hundreds of years ago. It's essentially a Civil War, modern invention of that era. Was kind of lost into obscurity in the intervening
You know, I
years.
need to actually correct you that because that was actually invented by the Romans. So it was 2,000 years ago that they invented tourniquets.
Sorry.
There you go.
By the Roman army.
Yeah. Anyway, go on. Yeah.
Thanks for that correction, Jose.
Yeah.
I'll meet you after in the lobby.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, you fast forward to the modern era, and this technology was brought back into use in the Iraq and then subsequently the Afghanistan wars, and then has now crept into the civilian sector with our unfortunate mass shootings. And so a number of the technologies that were perfected in the military in the last, say, 10 or 20 years are now finding their way into the civilian sector. And that's actually I think, an interesting case study on a technology that is going the opposite direction.
Steve, you want to
Well,
address it?
the problems we encounter clinically in the civilian side, I do at work every day. I often think about these things in terms of what it's like for a field person having to do the same thing. For example, airway management and tracheal intubation. It's a stressful evolution for people, even in the hospital, in the controlled circumstances, and knowing what it's like to be on a C-130 at 3 o'clock in the morning and having to intubate somebody. And this is a stressful evolution for people. It's one of the most stressful things they do. So my approach to the technology was, how can I make this easier in that circumstance? Because if I can make this easier in that circumstance, then it's going to be even better in a controlled environment. And so that is a real motivator for me to develop the technology to think about those field medics and folks in a tent in Iraq or Northern Africa or wherever they might be, to just make that job easier and take that stress away. I mean, if you think about it, if you're relieving this stress and anxiety of providers, you're invariably going to help patients. So I just think about those difficult and challenging environments. I also think about things like how much it weighs, how big it is, all those sorts of things. Is this a practical thing for people to use in the field? Because if the answer is yes for the field, it's going to be yes for the hospital, right? If it's not an enormous contraption. So I really try to think about things in terms of that. What is it like for somebody in the middle of nowhere who can't take a lot of things, and so on and so forth. So as such, I've really been trying to then introduce my technology with the military medic. And when I say medic, I mean not only the paramedic, but the military physician field operator, if you will, and so on and so forth. So and then I'll just go on. When you say the military, it's kind of dawned on me today. We were just talking this a moment ago. It's almost a misnomer to say the military, because when you step back, it's like saying I'm going to go sell to the company, when in fact there's hundreds of companies, and the military is so, the routes to commercialization or to interact in ways like we talked about is so broad, not only for every branch, not only for the whole military, but even for every branch. Every branch has its own separate sort of acronymed letters, organizations that are interested in technology. So I just went to Defense Innovations Conference in Tampa a couple weeks ago. I heard Mr. Detlov talk there as well, and I realized, I walked away thinking, this is daunting. What is the route to getting what you feel is a valuable product at what, as you say, TRL level? It's a very daunting process. And so I know I'm going off on a little tangent there. And I gained a lot of insight at that conference, but it's a tough thing to do. So my strategy now with interacting with the military is hopefully through these CRADAs and through my participation at the AMED Center of School. So it's a challenging process to do what we're talking about doing.
Yeah, and I guess a rule of thumb for that is, if you have any questions, remember this number, 1-800-BARRY-THAT-LOVE, basically. So call Barry and Bob Charles, exactly. So Bruce, you were going to say something?
Just, the user level is so profound. I think all of us have had, device invention. I have an airway device this summer. The Claymore mine, the United States Claymore mine. Does anybody know what is written on the front of a Claymore mine? It says this side towards enemy.
Yeah.
And now, why did they do that? Because that's fundamentally the KISS principle. which was invented by the U.S. Army, by the way, not the Romans.
Yeah.
And the keep it simple, stupid principle, and it's really important. So simplicity, survivability. I would give a shout out to Verathon, the inventors of GlideScope. And they had a very nice, very elegant, that we all use in the OR, the emergency rooms, our trauma centers every day. But they also developed a special model just for the combat scenario. It's called the Ranger model. The size of it exactly fits. You see, would you stand up, sir, in the back? Would you please? And kind of raise your thigh a little bit. I want to show your cargo pocket. You have a cargo pocket on that uniform? Okay. The Ranger GlideScope innovative device is exactly defined to fit into the left front pocket of a medic's cargo pocket. That's brilliant. Thank you, sir. You know, those are the kind of things that go into from the industry side. You got to put into. And I tell you, there's a commonality here for the most part. These are folks that have been in the mud or been in the dirt or been on the ships, been in the combat, those kind of things. And so if you don't have those kind of networking or contacts yourselves, find them. Find a medic. Find a retired medic, find a retired infantry guy and say, hey, does this make sense? And there's nothing that will beat that.
How do you find them? How do you find somebody like that?
Well, I think in the city of San Antonio, there's probably not a particular shortage of that.
Yeah.
I sit on one of these panels, you know, but it really gives you the benefit of veterans. And I'll tell you, by the way, it's not always the medics. Some of our best research and kind of soldier-proofing sort of work has been done with infantrymen. So, for instance, we did a study using satellite telemedicine on the move, where we had combat lifesavers. Those are not medics. They're not physicians. They're not nurses. They are infantrymen. They're guys that shoot people. But you can train them to be combat lifesavers. And we actually were able to train those guys how to put in an intratracheal, or actually how to do a cricothyrotomy. And so you find those guys, they understand standards, they understand training, and you get one of those guys involved. They have big mafia networks. Probably the most powerful network in San Antonio is the retired NCO network. Boy, no one ever touched those guys. And they'll find them.
Yeah, I want to keep on that a little bit because he made an interesting statement. He said, go find the medic and see what kind of things that he needs. And I have to kind of caution you guys on that, because we get, at least on the government side, we get a lot of these things where somebody comes in and says, hey, I found this dude and he was deployed and he would like to have this widget that looks like that, right? And unfortunately, he's just an N of one. So be careful when taking the opinion of just one person. I mean, if you have a group to reach a consensus, then you might have something there. But even if you have consensus, the fact is, would we have a requirement to actually deploy something? And that's something that you're going to hear over and over and over as you're trying to work with the military. The military has to have a requirement to build something that is deployable. Just because you have a great idea that if you're shown it helps, if we don't have a validated requirement, it will not make it into the field. So that's been one of our challenges, to try to convince the industry that, hey, without a requirement, yeah, your great idea is never going to make it into the hands of the medic or the surgeon. Question for you guys, and I like comments from everybody. So, I always make the statement that it doesn't really matter whether you are somebody that is shot in the middle of Baghdad or somebody that is shot in the middle of Detroit, right? The solutions, the products, the technology we're going to use to save that person is going to be relatively the same. Would you agree or not with that statement?
I would have to agree. A gunshot wound is a gunshot wound. Obviously, a military gunshot wound might be more devastating, but that nowadays may not be the case. With regard to separated limbs, limbs that are detached as a result of trauma are ubiquitous, not only in the military, but in agriculture, industry, in the civilian sector. And in both cases, we need to keep those limbs alive. And we need a technology that is, one, field deployable, which means it's small, it's compact, it's inexpensive, and it will maintain the integrity of a piece of tissue for at least 24 hours or until the injured individual can be stabilized and accept that replantation.
I was going to say, ask Ramon, see what he thinks.
So you're right up my alley.
Yeah.
So I would agree that the initial injury is going to be managed similarly with a tourniquet or care in the field. But initially, in a combat setting or care under fire, we're in a civilian setting, unlikely or less likely than in a combat setting. But as you start moving that patient to a higher level of care, now you go to a facility. What that facility can provide can be very different. In a combat environment, then you have power issues, you have safety issues, you have equipment issues that you may not have brought in with you, replacement issues because it may have broken, et cetera. So there are differences as you start taking care of that patient. And that goes not just from the emergency room, but then to the operating room, and we're still talking about lighting, sterility, personnel, how many people do you have? So it does magnify as you start taking care of that patient. And for instance, the reason I developed my retractor was because I've been on the ship, operating on a mess deck, in the field, in Haiti, in Indonesia, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, where I've had those challenges where it's not like downtown San Antonio where I have everything available to me, and the circumstances of your environment kind of dictate what you need.
So you're basically saying that if it works for a austere military environment, most likely it will work on the civilian world, but not necessarily the other way around.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think you have to be more clever to solve problems for the field. Because it's smaller, lighter, maybe reusable, etc. So you have to put a lot more into than a big elaborate apparatus with multiple moving parts. And so I think that maybe sometimes translates into a better technology that you have to, like you were saying, you have to keep it simpler. And so you have to work, I think we'll work a lot harder to do that. Well, we can't have all these things. We can't have power. Oh, well, now I really have to think more about how to do this. So that's been a fun challenge for me to make it, as you say, as simple as possible, as autonomous as possible, to make an operator who has potentially much less experience to be able to use it. That takes a lot more thought than something that's very elaborate and technical, than something we can, you potentially find in a hospital. And then for economically, really, you end up with probably a cheaper device, and that's better for all of us. A cheaper device that works better. I mean, that's good for taxpayers, for the patients paying for these things, et cetera. So to try to solve military problems I think, austere military problems is there's an enormous windfall to doing it.
Yeah, and that's a good point. So one of the things I always tell people also is when you come to the DoD with new products, be aware of how they are used and what our requirements are. And what I mean by requirements, and I'll give an example because I don't think anybody's here from the University of Nebraska, are they? All right, good. So I actually got a paper to review for military medicine where they are proposing putting in a robotic, endoscopic, multi-arm system inside a forward surgical team. Right? And to me, obviously, my initial reaction was just reject it outright. But the reason not because the technology didn't work, because it did not realize how you operate in a forward surgical team. There's no way they would ever do that type of surgery in that environment. So as you work with the military, be aware of where you're trying to insert your technology, because that makes a huge difference. If you're trying to do an endoscopic robot, you're not going to suggest to put it in a forward surgical team. It's going to have to be much forward back. It's going to probably have to be somewhere at BAMC, for example. So that's one of the things that I always tell people. Be aware of the environment and how it's going to be used in the military.
So Jose, that brings up a really good question. I wonder if some of the audience are thinking, how does one discover the military's requirements, and in particular, the military medical requirements?
That's a really good question. If you find out, let me know, please, because sometimes, and I'm being facetious, but that's a very good question because we get that a lot. And the way the DoD is organized, we actually have an organization who is devoted to making the requirements for us. I mean, and that organization basically are combat developers, and every service has their combat developer organization. Those are the ones that interact with the field units. Those are the organizations that are basically our sensing organizations. They're the ones who then come back to us and give us, hey, this is what you should be working on. Unfortunately, and I'll be the first one to admit, we don't do a good job of getting those requirements out to folks like you guys in the civilian world. You guys are the ones that are going to then be building our products. We're trying to make that easier, but you're absolutely right. There is an issue that we can definitely improve.
One very easy way of doing that is to go to grants.gov and type in DoD, and all the RFAs are dropped right there in front of you.
That is not true. And I'll tell you why that's not true, right? Those are not requirements documents. Those are grants where we want to do research on certain topics. At some point, if a product is going to be come out of that, then that's when the requirements come in. But yes, I would not necessarily, just because we have an RFP on a specific broad topic, that doesn't mean whatever comes out of that is going to have a requirement to be fielded. Dr. Pusateri?
I'd like to suggest that one of the best and probably most reliable ways to understand what the military needs, these requirements that Dr. Salinas is talking about, is this is Tony Pusateri from the Army Institute of Surgical Research. I'd like to maybe add a little to this and suggest that although it doesn't sound like an official mechanism, one of the most effective ways to do this is to establish collaborative partnerships with people who are already working at our military labs here, whose job it is to understand those requirements. And if you can develop a relationship in one area, it's a two-way street. So you'll begin to understand broader scope. You'll begin to develop. You'll understand who the contacts are for another technology you might be thinking of. I know it's not as easy as looking on a website and trying to find all that, but Dr. Salinas is correct. It's very complicated for even the military labs to understand where all the requirements are and how they're evolving.
Somebody had a question in the back.
Yes, so you were talking about requirements, and I understand there's requirements documents. So apparently you get these in some form on some kind of basis. Is there a way to ask about that, or?
Well, you can ask. I don't know if we can give them to you. Well, you're absolutely right. So there's actually multiple requirements documents that we use. Whether they are publicly available, that I do not know. Do you know if we can send them out?
I think they are. There's versions of them that are publicly released. It could give you some.
I believe that there are at least versions that can be released. But to be honest, I think the best way to understand what those documents mean is to develop relationships.
Correct.
Yeah. So Jose, the issue with requirements is it's not the only area that a person with a technology would want to look at. Requirements represent sort of a degree of formality in the acquisition process that the military is sort of committing down a pathway to get something. But if you want to have a technology that's a little more advanced, not quite on the requirements horizon, that's a different set of sort of understandings. And I think Dr. Pusateri's comment that you have to engage with the labs and get those one-to-one conversations are very important. And not to discount those grants. I think they provide excellent clues to where money's being poured into future projects. So I think all of the answers are partially correct. And as a civilian inventor who's trying to penetrate this black box, I think it can be frustrating. It's difficult to understand why all the requirements aren't simply in a website.
Yeah.
I can suggest to you that in my experience, there is no one single repository for all medical requirements in the military. I think it's a distributed network, and for whatever reason, it's not centralized.
Bruce, you want to comment on that?
Let me just second that. I think those connections with the major the labs like ISR. I'll give you another example is USAREL, the Air Medical Research Lab in Fort Rucker, Alabama, is a great source. So maybe one of the clearest standards out there are dealing with airworthiness certificates, meaning that before you put a new defibrillator on a helicopter, you want to make sure it doesn't make the helicopter fall out of the sky when you activate it. That'd be the world's best precordial thumb. But the guys at the lab, so there are some pretty standards about radiation and EMF, interference and weight and some things like that. I imagine on the Navy there's probably some equivalents on that. But those are probably the most transparent standards out there. Once you get beyond that, as Rob indicated, it becomes more and more opaque.
Well, one thing I've noticed, the opinion I'm starting to form, is that the setup for requirements as they relate to things like SBIRs and STTR grants that seems like it's kind of well established, that's the clearest realm I can see. But for inventors who are at a higher level of development, that to me is where it seems like it's, as you say, a black box, and it becomes very unclear as to what to do with that kind of technology that may not meet a specific requirement, but definitely solves an important problem. And the one branch, not really necessarily branch, but the one organization that seems to have refined that process is the Special Operations Command. And they have, through their SoftWorks website and these other acronym websites, is a place that you can just submit your technology with illustrations, video, what have you. They have a whole lab there at Tampa and McDill that you can bring a technology. You can just show up with it. And so that seems clear to me. But the rest of the network, in terms of how do I get in the door, what door do I open, it seems really, really difficult.
Yeah.
Really challenging. I know why Special Operations Commands can do that, because they're so small. They're just
Well,
a small
and on the
group.
flip side of that also, we get a lot of these concepts where they go and work with special operations. By the way, special operations is not big army. They're a very small elite unit, and those guys are willing to try anything. And unfortunately, we get a lot of these cases where somebody gave the technology to special forces. They loved it, right? And they come back to us and said, well, why don't you deploy it across the big army? And the answer is because we're not special forces. Just because it works for them, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for the rest of the army. Special forces are, 2,000 medical personnel, whereas we have a couple 100,000 for the big army, and they're a lot more trained, obviously. So
Yeah.
let's not make that mistake.
But they just have a process,
Yeah,
though.
correct.
You know what I mean? Is that it seems like I can get my arms around this.
Jose, I did want to mention that if someone comes
Who's-
up with
who's
a
talking?
technology
Oh, okay.
that answers a problem in the trauma space that we have, and I've seen this fairly recently, we can go through our process and make it a requirement. I mean, we aren't, that should not be a showstopper. The difficulty that's being expressed is, well, I've got this technology, I've got a proof of concept, I've got a prototype, and somebody at ISR or elsewhere is going to say, yep, we could use that. Well, they're actually going to be working with the folks at the Army Medical Department Center and School right there on Fort Sam Houston to say, we need to create a requirement. This is something we hadn't thought about, but yes, we need it. We've got a prototype, we've got a 50% answer here, and with a little pulling, we can get this one through the door. So we can make that happen.
Bob, real quick, I know from the Air Force, I haven't gone through that process and been on the high performance team with that. How long does that typically take for, to get it? Sorry. There's no. Yeah, this is the Army.
Yeah, so
So it depends. We're jumping on a technology now that we didn't know it was possible to.
That anybody had moved that far. It's a sonography for people who've gotten a lot of shrapnel in them. And there's some companies that are working together that have moved it along. Well, we're helping to get the requirement written and moving it fairly quickly. And we're working on a crater. We're going to give them a gazillion MRIs, anything we have that shows shrapnel, so they could see if their technology picks it up. So we can do it. It's really just finding the people within the system that are in that space, and at worst, call our office, call Barry. At worst, UTSA could call Mtech and say, we've moved this along. We need just a little push to get a prototype finished, and then we think we can make it happen, and let the system work. If it's something that we say, yeah, we like that could really help fill a need, we'll help with the requirement.
over here.
So I'm Chris Rabago from Center for the Intrepid and also with the Extremity Trauma and Amputation Center of Excellence. And just from our own experience, I think one of the things that you are looking to develop something is even consider just calling MRMC and the program managers out that way. I mean, again, we're talking a lot of critical care here, but I'm in the rehab space, but those program managers at MRMC know intramurally who they're funding, where their labs are, and because not everyone's a funded lab like ISR is, we have dispersed labs. And so I've been given the recommendation from MRMC. My program manager says, there's someone with this technology, it's in your space, you got to talk to them. And then either you can supplement, because now I can do the clinical trials for that study. We now got that SBIR that doubled up and tripled up on other awards. So, I mean, those are different spaces. And of course, we have the subject matter experts as well to kind of gear that technology as well. So, I mean, a lot of times us as, civilian scientists, we're also looking for those partners. It's not like you guys are looking and saying, I can't find them. We're doing the same thing. Where are they? And so I think going through the program managers at MRMC is always a good thing.
And I think what everybody's kind of agreeing to is that, reach out, like Dr. Pusateri said, reach out to us and figure out who the appropriate person is, and we'll establish those collaborations and see if your technology is worthwhile. Ramon, were you
Yeah,
gonna
so just to comment on the MRMC, so we reached out to JPC6 and Todd Rasmussen regarding our particular product, and we talked
You
to
might want to say,
MRMC.
so JPC6 is our Combat Casualty Care Program, for those of you that don't know that. Go ahead.
So we went through those avenues to try to see if we could generate a requirement, or how can we get our device developed in collaboration with the military. And the end result of that was that they were happy to evaluate a finalized prototype, but to get it to that point was the biggest challenge as far as device development. And that's been the biggest challenge for me working with the military, is that, number one, there's no easy venue for getting it to that point. And funding is the second question. Where's that money going to come from? And I'm not sure if the other panelists have had similar experiences.
That sounded like another transaction.
I learned about that today.
When Todd was there in MRNC, we didn't have that program. That would fit in perfectly, where UTSA could call Mtech and say, this is what we've got. Would there be an interest? Mtech picks up the phone, calls us, and gets it to the program managers and the funders, and off we go to the races, because if you've got it that far, there's going to be somebody in industry that you're probably getting ready to talk to that also has some money and can share.
Yeah, and actually that's exactly what we've had to do. So I imagine the experience has been similar, but we've had to, first to get funding, the university was able to provide some, but not all. We've had to actually go out to get venture capital. We've applied for several companies. We've talked to a couple of companies regarding licensing. But again, my original, and probably our original idea, was to get this with the military, but we've had to kind of go around it to get it to a point where the military can then be involved. But the other transaction venue or avenue I learned about today, thank you for sharing that, because I didn't know it existed.
Oops, you were going to say something?
Yeah, there are so many programs, again, with all those acronyms, that people don't know about even inside the military enterprise. And the AMT program, AAMTI, out of Tatrick, is a wonderful program. And I know some of the folks here have been able to utilize it, in which the company has the ability to put a product into a military medical setting and get paid to produce them. The PI is actually a military physician, and the question asked is it cheaper, better, faster? And so it's a little past your prototype stage. You actually have to have a finished product that can be used on a patient, but that's another transition step. Everybody has pointed to the fact that there are so many different places for this knowledge, and it's the reason that the web world, unfortunately, is a failure in my personal view as a web developer on the side. We're hoping to stand up what we call the Purple Book. We'd like to call it the DHA Purple Book. We'll see whether DHA wants to take that, because Navy requirements, Air Force requirements, Army requirements, Army needs, Air Force needs, all of this has to at some point come together. And my recommendation for everyone in the audience, don't rely on the bureaucracy to make that happen. It takes a village, And the idea of the Purple Book is actually a community of practice, a OneNote notebook like what you saw this morning, where when you figure it out, you put it up there. Because you may go to all three services and say, what are the requirements? And maybe they're similar, maybe they're different. But you could actually create a page that says, here are the requirements for retractors across DoD. Well, you might be the only person who actually knows that in the world because you've consolidated it. And we hope to be able to share as community of practitioner members, both from inside the military as well as in the civilian marketplace.
So, question for you guys. We already talked about a couple of these things, but what are some of your other pain points, if that's the right way to say it, as you're trying to work with the military to commercialize your products? And where are there? I'm sure there's a lot of areas for improvement, but if you can focus on one, what would that be? Whether it's, it was painful to get a CRADA or painful to get a contract or painful to get a grant. I mean, where would you like to see a lot of improvement that we on this government side can look at to see if we can make it better?
My issue has always been with the development of the CRADA and the material transfer agreements. While with respect to my technology, I already have a prototype. It's working, it's demonstrated, and I would love to get it into the military laboratories for evaluation under their circumstances. So the CRADA is my difficulty.
What aspects of the CRADA? Is it taking too long? Is it too difficult to get? What would you say?
It's not particularly complex to prepare. It just takes a long time to get processed by the military side.
That's actually very surprising to me because, and Bob, I think you're in agreement that CRADAs typically are relatively easy for us to process.
Well, maybe my idea of a couple of months is a long time, whereas in the military, a couple of months is not all that long.
Oh, that would be really fast.
A couple months, again, it depends on what organization. If you're working with ISR, we almost never take a long time unless there's some legal hang-up. We have anyone from the ISR Tech Transfer Office? I don't see Rick Joes here, but not a week goes by that we aren't churning out CRADAs. So, and we go pretty quick with BAMC. Jane Ching Gunther could comment on that, but we snap these out pretty quick. So it could be if you're trying to work with the Navy, well, God help you. And that could be an issue, or even DHA, depending on what facility, because they're new to the game. I'm also their legal counsel for CRADAs, but they're still babies.
Well, my experience is with the ISR, and
wow.
It turns out that we're also using one of the, the other...
OTAs?
The OTA approach, and that seems to be a lot more productive.
Okay.
I think for the four of us, I think Leon's a little further ahead, but for the four of us, we had this sort of prototype level gadgetry, if I'm not mistaken. And for us, it's really where to turn, what door to knock on. It's like entering the directions into your phone, and you hit search, and nothing comes up. And that's really the, I don't think I've gone any further past that to express any more nuanced, frustrations other than, who do I talk to?
Barry?
Well, call me. I need to know the same answers that you do because so many people come up with something and they need help. We have at USAMDA a prototype lab. It's small. ECBC in Aberdeen, another part of the Army, has the biggest prototype facility I've ever seen. It makes me cry because I'd love to work there for a few months in the middle of the night and make stuff. They have every 3D printer you could imagine, including stainless steel printers. So if you're doing a complex prototype, they're the folk for you. And we've actually recommended to their commander that they create a super quick, super seamless way for folk to be able to get something made and test it. Because you need it, ISR needs it, BAMC needs it. we have to share these resources across the enterprise, and they're frequently hidden behind a gate. And so it is a matter of social networking more than a website that will get you there.
Well, I think, I mean, the short answer, basically, to follow on Barry's point, is that it depends, right? It really depends, and that's what my doctor always tells me. They never give you a straight answer. It's always, it depends. And the reason for that is because it really is depending on a lot of factors, depending on the maturity, depending on what the use is. If you have something that is already through a clinical trial, FDA approved, and you're just looking to maybe see if the military is a market, that's not us, right? That goes to advanced development, and they're the ones who are in charge of procurement and fielding. Whereas if you're still trying to develop a product, maybe you still need some animal testing and some of that area, well, then it is us, right? So depending on where you are with your product and depending on its use, it will fit in different organizations. And most people do not understand that. I mean, we do internally, but from somebody from the outside, they don't know. I mean, they see MRMC as one big global entity, and that's one of the issues that a lot of people have. Any other questions from the audience? Anything anybody wants to add to that?
I just have a comment. I think for prototyping, again, it depends on your technology and what you need. If you have something in the IT world, the military may or may not have that area, then I would seek outside, some industry or some company who can do it much better. And there are other aspects. For my own invention, I have to seek outside companies that can help me prototype and make what I need to make. And they'll make it for you in a few months with $50,000 very quickly if you want to move it fast. And in the Army, you do have bureaucracy and different issues. And ISR is geared for trauma, not geared for anything else, not for OB, PEDS, other issues. They're great for trauma. Again, for other things, you have to seek outside entities to help you to prototype and develop. And they can do it faster, quicker, but it does cost.
And I think the challenge is on their end, like, well, who is the other people and how do we get in touch with them? And fortunately, ISR, we're in San Antonio, so we see each other all the time. But if you have something that is not part of ISR, then what do you do? And I think that's kind of what you're asking, right? So, and we understand that it's a challenge for us also to try to communicate better with the outside world on some of our organizations and entities and try to let the world know who does what. It's been a communication challenge, and we admit that.
Kind of begs the question, isn't this the role of the Military Health Institute at UTSA?
Sir, you want to take that on?
To understand, you know,
That's a really good point, Bob.
it's a complex system out there. You have scientists who, you know, they want to do science. They're going to have a quick, please, how do I connect? It seems to me like that's the role for the Military Health Institute.
Yeah.
These are your pipelines. This is your connection. These are your funders. This is how you get things done.
Right, and Bob's point's taken. So this institute is 3 years in the making right now, and our charter is 4 pillars: research, education, clinical care, and engagement. We view this as part of that engagement. We work very closely with the VPRs and the Office of Tech Commercialization, but probably Dr. Gephardt needs to be sitting here because this is the extension of the discussion of research, and to include with our basic scientists, our clinicians, and how this university moves forward. I'll give you one example to answer your question. So we stood up a year ago a San Antonio Trauma Consortium. But Jane's point's taken. This is the trauma space that we're talking about now. It's formalized. It's got a charter. The members are UTSA, the engineering school there, our university, Texas Biomed, and Southwest Research Laboratories, which has a significant engineering component to it in the biospace. And we invite, as ex officio members, the ISR. They attend. Dr. Eastridge, who sits on that consortium, is also an Army colonel, reservist, trauma surgeon. Last year, he took the capability gaps, speaking to requirements, for the surgical space. Again, we're just talking about surgical space. You know, there were after-action reports coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan of what are the challenges for the warfighters. And he took those requirements, and the UTSA engineering students have to do an annual project, a prototype. And actually, one of those teams, engineering teams, won a $100,000 award last year. So we are doing it in that space now, but this is a complex discussion. But your point's taken, Bob, and we're building the aircraft as we're flying at our institute, but I think your point's taken. That's why we're having this meeting today, is that we view this space as very important. It's a natural extension of doing the basic science and the research. And so these gentlemen here and their colleagues are in the vanguard of this. I would say, you guys that have been at UT Health Center for some time, Dr. Bunegin can speak to this. This is a new discussion for UT Health, maturing this ecosystem. But we're committed to doing it because we see that there is intrinsic merit to it. There's fiscal merit, there's academic merit, and we're good stewards for the nation's treasure. So I applaud you for saying that, and we want to keep taking it to the next level in the years ahead. And it speaks to the value of having this Military Health Institute, because we wouldn't be having this discussion if it wasn't here. Yes?
I'd also say the consortium with the Military Health Research Foundation asked Mtech if they could give us a list of the mid to larger size businesses that were revenue generating, not just startups, that we could connect with as well to make those kind of connections. So I think that's the ideal of the consortium, is that you then have those connections. The problem is that most, I mean, I'm a former pharmaceutical scientist, Fortune top 5 pharmaceutical. They don't have business development in that area. They have the most resources and the least interest because they see working with the military as being so difficult. And they don't know about OTAs at all. So they don't know that we've got this new avenue. They just think it's going to have to be a contract and it's going to be painful, and they're going to ask for too much skin on the table, which they have. But I think the consortium, ideally, if Mtech can let those that are trying to access Mtech vehicles know what kind of large resources in the pharmaceutical medical device world that they have, that would help a lot, because then we could assess before we even apply for those BAAs or whatever, whether this is even going to fly or not. So I'd say the consortium if possible, but we haven't gotten a response from Mtech yet. So.
Got another question in the back?
So would it be fair to say then that we can go to MHI and say, wherever I am in this process, whatever development level I have on my prototype or not, that I can go to MHI and I can say, how do I plug into this ecosystem? What are my options? Is that fair to say?
We certainly can offer, just like Jose does and Dr. Research does, or whatever the domain is. We can offer our good offices to help connect the dots. But we can't run with the football. We don't have the resources to find the venture capitalists, to take it through the quote-unquote valley of death. But we certainly can be an advocate, and we will be an advocate. But we have to work with our Office of Technology Commercialization and our VPR, and we're a matrixed organization. I wish we were a large institute. We're a team of teams, and we're a facilitating institute, but you certainly can approach us, and we will attempt make every effort to connect the dots for you. Yeah. And as the ecosystem matures in San Antonio, hopefully there'll be an office within the mayor's office, potentially someday. This is going to start to mature, and you're going to have quite an engine here in San Antonio in the years ahead. I'm hopeful that'll happen. I don't know, John, I don't want to speak for you.
So in the OTC, we do a lot of work connecting people to investors. Every source, whether it's in San Antonio or, we've had investments from China, from Hong Kong, from Boston, lots of places. So we try to make those connections for our startups. However, industry, and we do have some direct licenses that are in place, but industry, you wouldn't expect this. They have the billions of dollars, and then they turn around and ask us, well, just like some of the companies we talked to for the retractor, if it was further along, if we had a pig study, you have the money for a pig study. We don't have the funds for that. So it's very frustrating because they want it de-risked before they invest. And the startups that are out there trying to raise capital, the venture capitalists want it to be more de-risked. And we have some very good management teams and startups out there trying to raise money, and they're having a hell of a time raising money. And you know, talk about the economy's great or whatever, but it's hard to get capital right now.
All right. Any other questions? Anybody wants to bring anything up? Ed.
I'm Ed Davis with the San Antonio Economic Development Corporation, which is a nonprofit arm of the city to help the city do economic development. And we've recognized the need to do a better job in our community to help leverage military research for commercialization opportunities. So we're getting ready to embark on a 6-month feasibility study to determine the need. We're pretty sure there is a need for either a full-time office or a position to help connect the dots, so to speak, between folks at the university and the military, or in the private sector and the university, not only to help the military, but also to help the community create commercialization opportunities and create economic development. So we hope, we know it'll be a mutual benefit, so give us a few months and then we'll see. We got to figure out how to fund it, where to put it, but we're pretty sure there's a need, but we've got to go through a process like anybody else. So.
All right, that's a good segue. Let's talk about the future. So, anybody not know what the NDAA is? National Defense Authorization Act. That is the act that Congress signs to fund the DoD. This year, the NDAA has basically a requirement to create a national military-civilian trauma partnership and basically replicate the military trauma system on the civilian side. So I'm looking at my panelists, especially you, Ramon. What opportunities is that going to create in terms of trying to create new relationships and new products and new commercialization opportunities between the military and the civilian world?
So I think it's going to be fantastic, and we can't wait for it to actually get funded and start. So as far as trauma systems now, there's really only one trauma center that's military. That's BAMC right here in San Antonio. The rest of the hospitals for the military do not do trauma, which is crazy because that's what we do. We go out and take care of combat casualties. So the Air Force has done a very good job of having their surgeons work at civilian centers like San Antonio here, where it's busy and you can stay up to speed regarding trauma. What will happen now with the NDAA is we will be co-located with active duty trauma surgeons or surgeons and other medical providers at our civilian facilities, which tend to be busier and you can stay up to speed on current trauma care. As far as how it will affect research, right now, in order for me to collaborate with the military, I have to have a day off. Where I don't have clinical responsibility, I have to go over to ISR, wait a while, get on base, hopefully my
get through the gate first, yeah.
Et cetera, set up an appointment, get through ISR, and then talk to whoever I need to talk to. Having us co-located allows us to really just collaborate on a daily basis, on joint projects, joint issues, et cetera. Educate each other. The non-prior military civilian providers can get educated on what the military needs. So it's going to be outstanding. It's been a long time coming. I'm glad it finally got approved. So we're looking forward to it here in San Antonio.
Anybody want to add to that? No? Go ahead, sir.
I think you keep getting up, but just to make people aware, we have Admiral McCraven is our chancellor of our UT system, and he realizes the importance of this collaboration with the military health system. And in part the Defense Health Agency as it evolves in its roles and responsibilities. So there's a formal working group for the UT system on partnering with the Defense Health Agency and their 9 area, their research and development area, and then in turn with the respective services. So Mr. Charles brought up the issue of how hopefully over time this entity will mature up there in Washington, the Defense Health Agency and their authorities, and we're lead turning that. We're starting in areas of trauma, telehealth, and then systems of care. But the point was taken from Ramon here a minute ago is that as they start executing the NDAA authorities in the years ahead, the UT system has a lot of opportunity, not only here in San Antonio, but in Houston, UT Southwestern, and also the Dell School up in Austin and their level 1 trauma center there too. So you'll see in that space, but I don't want to ignore Jane's point's taken. We can't ignore these other areas. Infectious disease is a great example, or other disciplines that certainly have great relevance for the military space. I don't want it just to be a trauma or evac focused discussion, because we ought to think broadly here today and as a city.
All right, any other questions? Anything you want to talk about? All right, I have a few more that we can talk about. All right, so let's stay with the topic of the future. Anybody know how big Iraq is in terms of size? Anybody care to guess?
Texas.
Yeah, it's about the size of Texas. Where are we going to be fighting in the future? We're going to probably be fighting Pacific, Africa. How big is Africa? How big is Africa? Bigger than Texas, right?
No,
What about the Pacific? How big is the Pacific? A lot bigger than Africa.
Depends if you count the water.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things that the military is doing is they're going to focus, they're starting to focus on product development and developing solutions in our future battle spaces. And those include not just Iraq, which is the size of Texas, but also includes operations in Africa, includes operations on the Pacific coast. So let me give an example of what happens if you operate in those types of environments. Let's assume that you walk out of here and you get run over by a car. What would happen if your nearest trauma center is not University Hospital, but is NYU in New York City, right? Those are the types of environments that we're looking at to operate for the future, and it's going to create a lot of challenges, right? So that's one of the things that we are looking at in the future to develop products and solutions for that. If you have that type of environment, there's a good chance that you're not going to be able to take your patient and get him to a trauma surgeon within 1 hour. It is what we call the prolonged field care scenario. You're going to have to hold the patient with you in the field for extended periods. So how are we going to deal with that? How is the military going to deal with that? We don't know. It is an open question. We are just starting to fund the required resources to be able to support those types of operations. One way to deal with it is better training. Okay, yeah, we can do better training, right? But that's really not our wheelhouse. So we have organizations to do that. But the second solution is better technology, better medical products that can be given to medics to potentially offset the requirements that they currently have for patient care. So I'm going to look at you guys and see what kind of products do you foresee being developed as we move into a prolonged field care type of environment for future battlefields.
So I'll take a stab at this. So for those that aren't aware, I mean, Jose did a great job kind of giving the background of what prolonged care involves. So just step back a little bit. The focus, and you've sort of heard a little bit of the theme here from this panel, has traditionally been on sort of the trauma care, and in particular that very much that acute care that occurs in the far forward aspects of the battlefield. It's the interventions, it might be the resuscitative surgeries, and then of course the Air Force has a big component where they want to be able to sustain these folks on an aircraft for a 6 or 12-hour flight across the Atlantic or Pacific Oceans. Prolonged care changes all that. What it really says is you're not going to have necessarily these surgical capabilities. You're not going to necessarily have the ability to fly across and get those casualties to a trauma center in the continental United States. You've got, meaning the providers in the battlefield, you're going to have to sustain this casualty in some sort of state of preservation so that their injuries don't progress for, could be, 3, 5, 7 days, depending on how it's framed, before they're going to get the advanced care. This opens up an entire new front in technologies, things that didn't have much application in military medicine in the traditional sort of acute trauma care setting. All of a sudden now have very much application. Things that we hadn't thought about, like hydration, maintaining kidney function. All these things we simply said earlier, hey, you know, they'll make it through for their first 6 or 12 hours, and then they can deal with that in the trauma center on the continental United States. Now we're going to have to deal with that on the battlefield. And so folks that are working in areas of biotech and that didn't have much of a presence in the previous paradigm might very much have a very strong presence in, I think, prolonged care. So I think it's not just going to double sort of the front. I think it's going to triple or quadruple it.
Bruce?
Well, and, you know, I think we do get a little bit away from some of the, you know, the front of the battlefield kind of stuff when you talk like this. Blood banking is going to be huge. You know, so obviously the real prize is somebody can come up with artificial blood. But the Ranger Blood program that's out there right now is a perfect example of this. The ability, these guys are walking blood bank type of things. I think you think about what kind of care occurs in an ICU today, and then translate that to a dusty tent in the middle of wherever you want to put it. A good example, we had a patient in Iraq that overdosed on ethylene glycol, on antifreeze. And traditionally, it's too easy. We call it nephrology, we put him on dialysis and save his life. Well, the nearest dialysis where we were was Landstuhl, Germany. And so how do you treat an antifreeze overdose, 24 hours away from where he can get care? Now, it's a good story, but we ended up doing rectal alcohol with Johnny Walker Blue Label bourbon.
How did you get alcohol there?
Well, you're not allowed to have it, but when the MPs start knocking on the doors saying, no questions asked, we know there's some booze in here, and they came back with a whole bucket full of, some very good liquor. But same kind of thing. So that's a perfect example. Ramon every day has to take care of trauma patients that, oh, by the way, have significant kidney injuries. And so, what's the solution set for that kind of prolonged austere care?
Yeah, other things are the bedding technology. I mean, you can lay on a NATO litter for several hours and be okay, but if you lay on one for 3 days, you're going to have horrific sores. The battery technology, the recharging. So there's a lot of new. If you go to these military medical or military technology conferences, there's a lot of solar going on for charged batteries. So those are the sort of things. We have ventilators, we have monitors, we have medicines. A lot of those things we can use, but these kind of simple things, these maintenance issues that we have in the ICU day to day, we have these lovely beds that, turn you and you don't get pressure sores, and other ways to just, all these problem preventative maneuvers we do, that's going to be really a good challenge. Because, 6 to 8 hours, okay, but 3 days, that's a whole different thing.
I agree with everything that's been mentioned, but additionally, I think the way forward is going to be with hemostatic agents. The reason most of these patients die in the field is because of bleeding. We've done a very good job with tourniquets. Tourniquets have saved a countless number of lives, and you can stop bleeding from every extremity as long as you can get it on. It's the interthoracic or interabdominal bleeding that you really need to be in an operating room or some other suite where we can stop the internal bleeding. So hemostatic agents, as they develop and are able to stop that bleeding, will prolong field care. Low volume resuscitation, when patients arrive here, they receive 10, 20, 30, 40 units of blood, depending on what they need. But initially, before they arrive to a hospital, it's been shown that low volume resuscitation, just getting a blood pressure just enough to maintain perfusion of organs, saves lives. So maintaining that in the field. And then lastly, I think Bruce mentioned is telemedicine. The individual out there taking care of this patient is not an advanced provider. Usually it's in very remote special operations regions, et cetera. That person needs guidance, and having telemedicine presence should be able to guide that provider to help them out.
In my opinion, I think it has to be more than that, because once you get past that initial acute stage, like you said, you basically stop the bleeding. I mean, he's hemodynamically stable. At that point, you get into critical care, and you get into an ICU kind of environment. And now you get into issues of multi-organ system failure. You get into issues of sepsis. I mean, how do you deal with a septic patient in the field? So it gets a lot more complicated, but yes, you're absolutely right. Initial hemodynamic stabilization is going to be key to a lot of these patients. Any questions from the audience related to this? All right, so let's see. This is more a question. Is Barry still here? Where's Barry? Okay. So one of the criticisms, and I'd like to get you guys' opinions on this, that we get from the government a lot, and this is kind of within your lane, Barry, and that is, if I have a startup, right, let's assume I'm a startup, Steve has a startup, and he wants to work with the military, and he wants to pull out technology from the military, right? He wants to basically grab one of your licenses, create a startup company. One of the problems that I keep hearing over and over again is the length of time it takes for the negotiations of a license. And in a startup world where, you need to get something going in a month, and then in the government world where it takes a year, how do you reconcile some of these issues in some of these, for some of these technologies that we're talking about?
Excellent question. Jose, when you met your wife before you got married, how long between then and the wedding?
And I need to think about that one. It was about a year. Yes, okay. Let's say a year.
About
Sure,
a year.
why not?
So our goal is to get to a wedding in less time than Jose did. And how do we do that? Well, we have to disclose a lot to each other in order to feel comfortable that the startup is really going to have the money to get it to the next stage, not to the finish line. Final product startups don't do. Final product, somebody buys you out. So if you think, hey, I've got the greatest thing going, and you're not thinking about the final stage, what's your joint venture? What's your sub-license plan? In order to really get people comfortable that a product's going to be fielded, you got to think as more than a startup. You actually have to think about what comes next, and can you get those folks involved early? That's a really useful thing, because what's the single biggest failure point? Money. Now, our goal would be to have a venture fund within the Army to help you through some of that valley of death. But face it, it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. We want you to go out and eat some dogs. Not really. We want you to go out and compete. And that's one of the reasons why the SBIR validation of a company is a great way to see, could they even write a business plan, right? Can you raise private capital, angel, venture, ECDev? The economic development groups around the country do a vetting that helps us as the military. Because we have a lot of inventors inside the military who want to go out and start a company. And they're the true believers. They invented it after all. It must work. It must be commercially viable. Well, not necessarily so. If they can't convince San Antonio's economic development folk to give them money, maybe that vetting was a critical link because, yeah, it may work in the lab, but not in the field. It may be field worthy, but there's no marketplace for it to support it.
I guess just I want to just comment because we face the same criticism and concern at the university. How quickly can you get a startup going? And we did one recently with Leon's company, and that went very, very rapidly. And there's a couple of things that we've modified over the years. One is we have licensing templates, which there's some standard things in there, but we coupled it with what I call a negotiation worksheet. So you have all of the things that you typically ask for, like royalties or milestones or upfront, right? And I put ranges that are reasonable, custom designed for pharma, med device. They're different. They're not the same markets. And then have the company come back with what is their preference for the deal. For example, maybe they want to give more equity and lower royalty. And my comment is you can't pick all low. That's not negotiation. That's the old way of just going back and forth, bottom feeding and fighting back up. And with what the company came back with, what they balanced it. It was literally an hour. And then it actually takes longer to get it signed by the people that have to sign it than it does to do a deal. And the other third thing is we call the back end, where all the legal terms are there. If they don't mess with the back end, like where UT system has to look at, you change something with indemnification or whatever. I'm sure the military probably has similar things that are sacrosanct that you can't change. But if people know that going in, that if you mess with that, it's going to really add to it. Anyway, those things we found to really speed up the process.
That's good information. So to follow up on that, and because I don't even know the answer to this. So Barry, do we have a mechanism to do maybe due diligence on marketing for some of these companies that are coming in, especially the startups?
So we have a lot of interested parties, mostly interested in getting us to pay to do it. But there's a group called MD5, and they're stood up specifically as a DoD entity to help launch startups from DoD technology. On the university side, obviously, you have your offices, you have your ECDev folk, but the Department of Defense is not famous for doing startups, and we could be more effective if indeed we take the modern world. I don't know about you guys, but I go to Lowe's and Home Depot every week. I'm addicted. And at least 5 times in the past year, I stood there, pulled out my iPhone or my phone, and I bought something on Amazon that they don't stock anymore at Lowe's or Home Depot. And I bought it in the time that I was standing online to ask somebody a question. And I walked out of the store because tomorrow it was delivered to my house. Now, this argues for the fact that the people in tech transfer, where do they come from? Anybody know where the tech transfer industry came from? Grants administrators. Because they were the only folks who could possibly understand what a contract was. And yet, what are we? We're salespeople. We're trying to sell the dream. And what do we have? We have offices inside of gates. We're not salespeople yet until we get with the program. We haven't been able to. My apologies to everybody involved. You and companies out there should be able to do a transaction as simply as an Amazon one-click for things that it doesn't matter how much. We have tons of technology like cell lines that we just want to get into the hands of people who could do research with them. Why should I negotiate a 20-page agreement for a cell line? I shouldn't. Click-stream licensing, where somebody can negotiate against the algorithm, web-based contract negotiation systems, are where we are headed. Will we get there before I die? I don't know. I hope that we can truly get to the point where if the net present value of that technology is $1 million for anybody who's going to license it, the government's easier to deal with. We're agnostic to cash flow because we just raise your taxes. So if I need $1 million and somebody's willing to pay me $1 million up front or $3 million to take the risk that they'll pay me all the way at the end, I should be able to take that deal without you even talking to me as a company. And yet we have folks who say, no, it has to go through the process of signature and review and signature. But Amazon kicked Main Street in the butt because people want it now. We're impatient, and we should be impatient about tech transfer.
I'd just like to add one other thing. The panel that's sitting in the front here.
Can you introduce yourself,
I'm
please?
Mary McCafferty, Office of Technology Commercialization. There's a way we're looking at inventors at the university is that they're not necessarily 5 inventors sitting in front of you. They're 5 assets that our office is working hard to enhance in any way possible for them to fulfill their dreams. So it's not just the product that they're at that moment. We are working hard to be customer focused, and I understand the DoD is a much larger organization, but to have these relationships looked upon as relationships, yes, a click is very important, but to have the relationship here and with Bob is really beneficial. And yes, a click is important, but there really are people on both ends of this that it's just too valuable to let it go.
And we also have the one-click cell line type licenses, but if you have a $1 billion drug, Amazon doesn't have that. So we do have more complex agreements as well.
All All right, I have a question for Bob up there. So correct me if I'm wrong, right? So one of the things that we always get that delays a lot of our agreements is people basically assume that some of these agreements have to stay within the boilerplate language, and that's not necessarily true, correct? One of the things that we tend to do with in the military is we are.
I'm going to answer your one question.
I'm sorry?
Correct.
What?
You wanted one question. The answer is correct. They don't
Correct.
have
So one of the things that people need to be aware of is that we're incredibly flexible in working agreements with you. There's only one caveat, and that caveat is you cannot ask us to change the agreement if it's going to violate federal law. Other than that, we are happy to work with you, correct?
to. Correct.
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, CRADA is defined in statute, and I showed you the definition. There's no Congress, nor the Army, nor DOD, though it tried. Is there a set template? I mean, we have to start somewhere. But we've had 10,000 variations on our CRADA. I'll just give one example. Here in Texas, the UT system is part of falls under their rules for indemnification and sovereign immunity. So while our standard template indicates that our CRADA partner will agree to indemnify us, you can't do that in Texas. So we delete that when we're dealing with you folks. I mean, and that is a millisecond kind of decision because we understand we've done it a million times. And we can, if there's reason, we can change almost anything in a CRADA, and we have. So it's a very flexible mechanism.
I have a CRADA question. There's there's a CRADA with the ISR and the UT Health. But if you do any individual process, project, whatever, do you have to generate another sort of sub-CRADA to define the terms of that relationship?
Bob?
Yeah, I assume what we have is a master agreement between the two. And it's easy as pie. You create whatever the next project is going to be. You work out with the PI at ISR, a statement of work. It gets signed off and off to the races.
Yeah, so you can actually create it. You can have a master CRADA, right? Or you can have an individual CRADA. An individual CRADA is for one specific project, one specific objective. And obviously, if you deviate from that, you have to do a new one. But if you have a master CRADA that covers like an area, then you don't necessarily have to modify it. Somebody else had a question up there?
Yeah, this is John Yevik from the 59th MedWing Tech Transfer Office. That statement would only apply maybe to the Army. The Air Force does not do master CRADAs.
Okay.
So if you're doing any collaborations with the Air Force, we do not do master CRADAs.
So basically, come work for the Army then. Yeah.
We are in dialogue with the air staff on what relationship we're going to have with the Air Force. Your point stated.
At some point, again, as I mentioned, we're trying to harmonize the practices. I'm being a bit, going back to my dictatorial self. I want the Navy and the Air Force to be able to do in their military tech transfer practices what the Army can do. So that's the hope, and if I can work it out, because all the Air Force's money comes out of the Defense Health Program. So essentially, they'll be playing by my rules pretty soon. At least that's the hope. And then you can do master CRADAs, because it will be, if you want the research money, you'll play by those rules. So that's the hope.
All right, we're running out of time here, so I just want to open it up to the audience for any final questions or thoughts. If you can give the panel members a round of applause. Thank you very much. And with that, I will turn it over to Joel Hepburn. Thank you very much, guys.
No, I tell you what, I really want to thank thanks, Jose. Yeah. We're going to give you an official milk here in a second.
Oh, okay.
But really, this is just the beginning of a dialogue, and a lot of great points made today. We've got it recorded, but this will be an iterative process with our academic, industry, government partners. It's an evolving landscape, to include Bob's just point now about the evolving landscape with the Defense Health Agency, the collaboration with our UT system and the military health system. But And then we're sitting in the broader context of research and commercialization writ large. We're one sub-element. And then we move into this prolonged field care space we start getting, as this was astutely mentioned, we're getting into the intensive care space, the long-term, we're bringing other domains and disciplines of medicine. So it's exciting. I think we all should just be committed to continuing this dialogue. When we hit firewalls and we don't have answers to questions, let's all be mutually committed to cross-talking and trying to connect those dots. And I wish it was the easy button all the time, but it's not. And, but we should be committed. And let's double back to those photos at the very beginning of the morning of why we're doing this. And, you know, I had a discussion with one of our trauma surgeons who was on duty Sunday night. One of those children, I don't know if it was one or two of the children, I'll talk to you, Ramon, had tourniquets on from EMS. And now we're teaching our EMS and our first responders how to use the tourniquets. We're doubling back from what we did 30 years ago in Cub Scouts. But, you know, it's serious business, it's worthy business, and I really appreciate y'all being here today. And I appreciate you taking the challenges we have and working on them in your own way. And let me know, as the director of the Military Health Institute, I'm fully committed to this. Mission success is vital, and failure is not an option. So God bless you, and thanks for being here today. Thank you.